Hello and welcome to episode 5 of A is for Architecture, with me, your host, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today to Tahl Kaminer, Reader in Architecture at the Welsh School of Architecture, University of Cardiff, about his 2016 book, The Efficacy of Architecture, published by Routledge, and his 2011 book, Architecture, Crisis and Resuscitation, published by Taylor and Francis, and the broad idea of the political in architecture, and discuss ideas of agency, practice, praxis, and participation in the built environment.
When we're talking about the city is more clearly and in a more direct way a result of political decision, ideological decision, and so on. Architecture is a bit more removed, and that's why it's always a little bit more difficult. It claims to be a form of art where the artist is the architect, and yet, of course, the architect is also dependent on the brief, on the person paying, and of course on the entire team taking part in the process. Now, where do we usually identify the political? Usually in the symbolic. That's a classic one. We say architecture symbolizes power. But what is that?
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome again to another episode. I'm with Tahl Kaminer. Tahl, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, Tahl Kaminer. I'm trained as an architect, but I'm nowadays a researcher. I'm based in Cardiff, where I'm called a reader, though I don't have so much time to read anymore since I got the job. But yes, at the Welsh School of Architecture, before that University of Edinburgh, and before that TU Delft. So a bit of experience with different universities and university cultures in architecture.
TU Delft is an enormous school, isn't it?
Yes, 3,500 students when I was there. I think they cut it down to 3,100. They struggled to cut it any smaller than that.
That's in just the architecture, spatial planning, urbanism kind of department.
Well, it is a faculty of architecture, and it includes real estate and housing, technology and urbanism. But architecture is the biggest department within this faculty. But again, it's dwarfed by Italian universities, right? I mean, let's not forget Rome, 20,000 students of architecture, Milano, 20,000 students of architecture. Even Venice was, I think, at 14,000 at one point. So, I mean, there are some massive continental universities for all kinds of historic reasons.
I suspect that's an interesting point to start from, actually. So the difference, obviously, in the UK is, so Kent, where I am, has about 450 in undergraduate, postgraduate, and PhD programs, master's programs. And that seems to me to be quite large, seems to be plenty for the amount of architecture that's required in the country. And it's one of the themes that you touch on in quite a bit of your writing, the book, The Efficacy of Architecture from 2016-17, your 2011 book, which I've been reading as well, Crisis and Resuscitation, Architecture, Crisis and Resuscitation. And also on that paper that the chapter of the book that you sent me recently from The Emancipation of Planning.
Right. I mean, I think it's a good place to start because it touches not just.
Well, we have a lack of architecture, and we seem to be comfortable with that.
I would say one of the reasons I think it's also relevant is because when we look for the reasons, we find structural reasons for these differences, and one of the things that interest me are how these structures shape the things we are. Right. So it's not just consciousness and who we are as individuals or individual subjects, but also the structures in which we operate. Yeah. And just without going into too much detail into some of these differences, just give you a kind of a taste of them. The story of the Italian universities comes very much, I think, from May 68, really, when there was a demand for open access to universities, no longer a selective process. Right, so that kind of opened the doors, and anybody can basically go and study architecture, and therefore you end up with 20,000 students of architecture, and very few find later jobs in architecture. When we move to the case of the Netherlands, it's different. I mean, there are not many schools of architecture. There's a huge Delft faculty and a smaller one in Eindhoven. Beyond that, they have these small schools of architecture, but those are very small, and they're meant for those who didn't have A levels, couldn't go to study architecture, study drafting, and then they can do part-time to become architects. Like you'll find one of these academies in Amsterdam. So Delft is a powerhouse, and every famous architect went through Delft simply because it's the biggest. Now, what's interesting about this size aspect is a different place it has in society. In a way, the dean in Delft can, contact the minister, right? There's direct connection to government. That gives the faculty a lot of power. It's also a kind of jewel in the crown within the University of TU Delft, itself a strong university. It has a lot of power because it has also real estate and housing. You get consultancies that advise government and whatnot. When you move to the schools in Britain, there's a kind of exchange going on. They have no power whatsoever. What they do have, though, is a lot of autonomy. Yeah. The government, because nobody cares about them, they are weak, but they can do, to say whatever they want is an exaggeration, but have a lot of freedom, right, compared to elsewhere, despite the fact they're externally accredited and all of these kind of things. In the Netherlands, because they are powerful, they're connected to government, they're also expected to deliver certain things to government. It's slightly different. So there's an exchange involved there, which is an interesting one for the discipline, even if I'm talking here specifically about the schools.
Do you think that has its, I mean, it's a completely speculative question and answer, I suppose, but does that have its basis in the kind of psychology of the nation? I mean, Britain is a peculiarly independent kind of country. I mean, we produced, so one of the themes you touched on a lot, and I'm going to come back into this, is this issue of neoliberalism, the kind of total freeing up of capital and capital processes into the culture at large. And there is, in a way, a little bit that architecture as a profession and as an industry feeds into and off that at the same time. And maybe the architecture schools likewise are simply responses to a cultural norm, which is, we don't like being told what to do.
Well, I think there are many ingredients here.
I don't want to suggest the Dutch like being told what to do, but you know what I mean.
But I think, first of all, I mean, I can't answer that question properly. It's not anything I researched, but I can throw in some of the ingredients which are probably part of it. I think that we don't like to be told what to do is incorrect. I mean, these countries with strong planning and strong governments like Sweden or Netherlands have also a very strong demand for freedom. I think in a way, when you look at all of the northern Protestant countries, and there's a history here to do with religion and the way religion got self-organized, if you like, and I'm talking about the book of Max Weber and so on, which is the real background here. And we're talking about societies which are much better organized and much less free than the societies of, let's say, the Mediterranean, right? Where government was never strong, right? Even in the peak of post-war years in Greece or Italy or all of these countries, government was very weak compared to Northern Europe. And in all of these northern countries, there's also a very strong counter demand for freedom. So both things, punk, for example, had to happen in a northern country, one would say, right? It had to happen in one of these places. These things go hand in hand. So this is one general aspect, right? The way kind of modern societies emerged, according to Max Weber, from the implementation of the work ethic in originally first Calvinist communities, in kind of Puritan communities, then other Protestant communities, and only later implemented in Catholic communities. And of course, religion has waned since then. It's no longer an organizing principle, but some of those ideas, like the work ethic, remained for a long time after people stopped going to churches as an important thing. So this is just one big thing, right, in the background. You can add to it other things. If you compare specifically to the Netherlands, you have a history on the one hand of trade, right, a big trading country, so very capitalist, you could say, early capitalist. It has a history where it didn't have strong nobility, as unlike Britain. This allowed the capitalists to become powerful earlier, right? Because it wasn't a strong nobility in the Netherlands historically. And then, of course, also the fact that half the land is reclaimed from the sea or so, which means that also you needed a social collective endeavor. That's not done by a person, right? So you see these contradictions emerging historically. I can throw into that also other political aspects. If you would study political science, you would probably read a book in your first year, where one of the things that you are taught is the kind of differences. Why does Britain have one kind of governance and, let's say, the Netherlands another? It will show you how the Netherlands emerged out of a kind of 7 or so different counties, if you like, different countries, if you like, each one with a different political, religious, let's say, coloring, right? One more Calvinist, one more Catholic, another one more Lutheran, and coming together, they had to compromise. And this delivered a certain kind of politics and political structures, which are different from the ones which developed in Britain. So there are all of these kind of ingredients, which again, I can't trace their roots into the structure of universities and schools and so on. But it is interesting because, for example, I remember in Edinburgh, I had an American colleague who was somewhat shocked about how, British schools and universities are, go about parity with all of the external examiner business that we have, in which, this idea of somehow parity, not just within the school, but also between different schools. But again, we end up with structure, right? I mean, British universities are also weird. They're not government-owned universities.
No.
And yet government treats them as if they're public, as if they're run by government. There's all kinds of laws and regulations, take the Freedom of Information Act, which apply to universities, even if they're not truly public. You go to the United States, and of course, universities are more independent. Government doesn't tell them so much what to do. You go to continental Europe, and you come to the situation where universities are government-owned. So again, I think, these are not just issues of some kind of culture. We want parity in Britain, and the Americans don't care about it. It's more that we are within one system, while American universities are not.
Yeah.
Right? So again, I want to bring it down again and again to the question of certain structures, which I can't always explain how they came into existence if I didn't look at the case itself. But the structure dictates or determines or shapes some of these obsessions or ways of doing things or internal cultures of institutions.
It's really good. I want to get back into some of your text, but I think that discussion does relate, because what you talk about in much of the work of yours that I've read in preparation for talking to you today is the issues around what are termed and what you refer to as the political. And the political in architecture. And I think that it would be good if you could sort of open that out, because I think the tendency is to think about that in Britain, for British students, for me, to mean party politics, Labour versus Conservative versus Green Party, or whatever. But I don't think you mean just that, or not even that. So what is the political in architecture?
So thanks for that question, because in a way that was also, let's say, the main interest of my last book in a way. And it was, my previous work was very much more about political economy, but in a way demonstrating how we are all influenced by what is trending, let's say, in reaction to the interest of more and more architects, young architects, in the questions of agency and change and the political. I also started looking more into some of these questions. Initially, I had kept away from them because this earlier discussion we had in architecture in the 1970s about politics and architecture was not a very healthy one. It was kind of circular, elliptic, didn't lead anywhere, and was also left kind of unresolved. This 1970s discussion, debate, if you like, in which people like Leon Krier took part, Kenneth Frampton, and many others. So yes, I mean, one of the problems of that is that when someone like Charles Jenks stepped into that debate in the 1970s, his position is that architecture is not political because he presumed that political is political parties, right? So one of the things I wanted to correct is that that's a very narrow way of looking at politics and the political. So let me take a step back a moment, because we need a couple of definitions, don't we, to be able to speak about this. So the first question is, of course, what is politics and the political? And, you can find many definitions in books of political science. Generally, we like to think of the of politics as, the kind of field in which power is distributed, something like that, where struggles over power are settled. But more useful here are some other definitions. So you have, for example, if you look at STS, right, that field of sociology which studies technology and science, they usually use the term politics with a capital P or with a lowercase p. I'm talking about Bruno Latour and the actor network theory people. So politics with a capital P is what we usually call politics, right? It's a parliaments, it's a political parties, trade unions, and so on. That's with a capital P. Lowercase p is the politics which are part of other things, right? That are outside this defined realm for politics. And of course, everything is political. Very useful to politicize areas of life which before were seen as non-political, helps with that. Here's an example, and apologies for taking some time to reach architecture in all of this.
No, sure.
But if you go to buy a pint of milk in the supermarket, you have to make certain choices. You can buy, a full milk, whole milk, low-fat milk, bio, organic, and so on. This kind of choice, or almond milk, soya milk, and so on, these choices say something, right? They're about lifestyle, we may call them, but this lifestyle is fed by ideology, right? You'll buy maybe almond if you are vegan and so on. So let's say your ideals, your values, your ideologies play out in this kind of choice. So, you could claim everything is political. My problem with that, even if I see that as useful, is that it becomes superfluous. If everything is political, you saying that buying a pint of milk is as political as, let's say, assassinating a prime minister. Now, surely this isn't the case. So obviously you could argue that everything is political, but not everything is political to the same degree. So we should, think about that, first of all. Second thing, when we're coming to towards architecture, we should also take into account how clearly political the urban field is. The urban is a focus of government policies, right? City councillors themselves, elected, of course, politicians, are very close to those, let's say, technical experts, whether in planning departments, housing, or others who make decisions which affect the city. So, when we're talking about the city is more clearly and in a more direct way a result of political decision, ideological decision, and so on. Architecture is a bit more removed, and that's why it's always a little bit more difficult. It claims to be a form of art where the artist is the architect. And yet, of course, the architect is also dependent on the brief, on the person paying, and of course, on the entire team taking part in the process. Now, where do we usually identify the political? Usually in the symbolic. That's a classic one. We say architecture symbolizes power. But what is that? I mean, it doesn't have to... It can be corporate power. It doesn't have to be, political power. That's just, it's just about, the bigger, the mightier, the, if it's glass towers in a desert, you're showing, it's all of these kind of things. That's one aspect. But of course, in the symbolic, there are other examples. I think I mentioned Adrian Forty writing about, Max Berg's Jarunhandel in 1913 in what's today's Wrocław, was Breslau back then, when the Kaiser wouldn't enter because this structure made of concrete, he identified it with socialism. Now, that brings us to the kind of back to the 1970s arguments where someone like Leon Krier claimed architecture cannot be fascist or democratic any more than a Wiener Schnitzel can be fascist or democratic. And his argument was that the neoclassicism of fascist Germany is detached from fascism. There's nothing in fascism which really asks for this kind of response. And yet, one of the things I try to argue in the book is that the symbolic, as much as we as architects are less interested in it, is there. It is very real. And these connections are meaningful. They were meaningful enough for the Kaiser not to enter Max Berg's huge hall, right? This kind of century hall. They affect us. And the fact that they can be recombined and they're temporary doesn't mean they're meaningless. So one thing is to reinstate the importance of the symbolic, which is at the heart of the political, without going into too much detail, because this is a slightly complicated issue. And I do in the book look a little bit at the political theory, which shows how the symbolic actually creates society itself, right? So claiming that the symbolic actually matters here. Even things that have tenuous connections, which can be broken, those things do matter after all. That's part of the political restructuring. So that's one field. But generally, I think it's also helpful to move away from the word politics sometimes and use the word ideology.
Yeah.
Understanding ideology as a kind of filter that frames how we interpret reality. I think that's one of the better definitions I've come across. That's through Althusser. So the filter through which we see reality, ideology. And then you have the word worldview, which is a more diffuse thing, right? The worldview is not a clear ideological set. It's not necessarily associated with a political party or one specific party. And its worldview is quite close to ideas like the spirit of the time, right? Zeitgeist and so on. It's the idea that there is a spirit of the time. Right now, 2021, when you look at the political field, people are arguing, fighting each other and so on. But, 50 years from now, they'll look back at this moment and we will look more uniform. We will share certain ideas and ideals. This is the worldview of our era, the dominant worldview, the alternative ones, of course. And architecture, as I try to argue in the book, is clearly a carrier of the kind of values, of the kind of worldviews of a certain era. And these are not things which are debated within politics itself, in the kind of capital P politics. You don't have, of course, political parties arguing about these things. These are bigger ideologies, worldviews, consensus worldviews, not of a specific party.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's quite interesting, that final point, that the capital P politics doesn't concern itself too much with ideology. And I think that I remember listening, I think it was to Peter Mandelson, New Labour's Dark Prince, Peter Mandelson, who on Radio 4 one morning, I think it's one of these things that sits in my imagination but might be a false memory, but talked about how Labour wasn't about ideology. New Labour wasn't about ideology, that they were post-ideological. And you saw that very clearly in the way, particularly, that political movement operated as both ostensibly left-wing, but with an extraordinary, again, Mandelson said they were, his famous phrase, something like, they're extremely relaxed about people becoming filthy rich. And it was sort of like it was a remarkable kind of admission that it would have been inelegant coming out of a Conservative, let alone someone within the Labour Party. So I think that's a really interesting point. But so in this idea of the political gets absorbed into architecture in the 1970s, as you point out, and you use the 68 student protests in France as this kind of fulcrum point around which this whole thing operates and moves. And you make a very interesting point about how there is a correspondence between some of these smaller scale discrepant practices, these insurgent practices, and actually the neoliberalism that emerges in the second half of the 20th century. Am I right in that? You almost argue that
Yes.
they're two sides of the same coin.
One of my interests in 68 is also because I notice the influence of it today. Not necessarily the events themselves, but the ideas which fed into 1968. For example, and not just on the architectural side, on all also on other levels. So the kind of anti-statism of a lot of the groups that saw the state as the enemy, right?
Yeah.
But it's also the fact that who are the most influential, I would say, theorists today? It's either those who really started off in May 68, like Tony Negri, going into factories back then, talking to workers as a kind of agitator and activist, or those who actually had books published and were well known then already, like Henri Lefebvre and so on. So actually a lot of the material has been forged in the radical left's opposition to social democracy. And I see this feeding into contemporary understandings. And that's beyond the fact that, if we talk about the interest in everyday life, if we talk about interest, for example, a few years ago, were into mapping, but also into participation, all of these kind of things, they were all present around then, right? That's really when these interests became important. And today they feed into a lot of current interests. That's one main interest in 68 itself. A second one is a question of, I am writing for some kind of reader. And who is that reader? It's a question of who is the we. So I'm writing not to someone who's, let's say, an opponent, adversary, but somebody who I see almost as part of that kind of big collective we. Primarily, of course, people who come from architecture and urbanism, right? That's my milieu, if you like, and ones which are somehow politically close, right? Something like that, probably. That's a kind of collective we there. Now, how does it feel if you are busy with a project which you believe produces something good, whether it's more freedom or more equality, and then you find out you've been working actually for your adversary the whole time?
Yeah.
And that is one of my concerns, that some of the kind of knee-jerk reactions and shibboleth of current moments don't see actually what they are forwarding.
Yeah.
That in a way, what you are promoting unintentionally is what you are against, partially because you are being influenced by material which was produced in a different situation of social democracy and welfare state, in which social democracy and welfare state were the enemy of those who you are reading. So kind of mix up today, which I hope I can help clarify.
Yeah, well, I fully understand that. So something that I've looked at before is the kind of the notion of participation. So 1969, and you've got Sherry Arnstein, as you mentioned Sherry Arnstein cite her a number of times, and this ladder of citizen participation. And participation then becomes absorbed into the political discourse, into the mainstream, and very, very rapidly gets defanged, declawed, and utilized in a kind of very, kind of evil genius sort of way. And we still operate, and you'll see a lot of practices, large scale practices, operating through a framework of citizen participation, which is anything but. A colleague of mine described participation very, very cleverly, described it as a way of implicating poor people in the terrible things you're about to do to them. And so I remember Uma Qatari's book, The Tyranny of Participation, which is about development in the global south largely, but there's this idea now that participation is a moral good, regardless of who you're doing it with, what you're doing it for, and what the outcomes are. It's a very interesting one. But I fully agree with you, and I think that capacity to step back. Now, how does that relate back to this idea of the political? So we go through this moment of the, shall we say, depoliticization of architecture, which is activated in the 60s, consolidated in the 70s through radical practices which are deinstitutional, anti-institutional, and to all intents and purposes anarchistic. Realized in the 1980s in laissez-faire planning and an absolute lack of control. And then we have this reemergence of the political narrative. It doesn't ever fully go away, but a reemergence of the political narrative. And we're sat there now trying to work out what the political is. I mean, what is your feeling about what these more politically orientated practices, what is their kind of modus operandi? What are they trying to do now? What are they trying to fight?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, in a way, Assemble told me that, the fact that they work with primarily with government, local or whatever government, basically with the public side of things, is their protection from being, let's say, I won't say exploited is the wrong word, but, doing the wrong thing, right? So by not working with developers, they kind of defend themselves, which is interesting because they don't put themselves in the anti-statist place as many of the others, right? Yeah. So they actually pro-statist almost. I will work with the government because the government is public interest representative and not with a developer, which is interesting. It's of course limited because we know government also does often the wrong things, right? We do know that, even if we think that the solution is also government. I think, first of all, there's no stopping of the localism agenda. I think my concern about these things, that one of the questions is, what is the priority here? Mm-hmm. Obviously, climate emergency is there at the top. Other big issues are the democratic deficit, which participation is there to resolve or to address, and then you have also issues of equality. And equality, not necessarily on human rights levels, but economic equality, poor and rich, and these kind of things. Now, these are all important, but you can't address everything at the same time. And what are the priorities? And the issue of equality, for me, is maybe more urgent than the political deficit, but not necessarily for you or for someone else. So it depends what your position is. Now, some time ago, when I was at the University of Edinburgh, I was running a seminar there for postgraduate students, and I had two guests. One was Anna Janic, an architect from University of Graz, who's a card-carrying member of the party, and I had also Oliver Escobar, who's from University of Edinburgh, from political science. He's somebody who works with participation on a very practical, active level of organizing communities and so on. Now, it was interesting because there was a real clash going on there between different schools of thought, and between two people who are very intelligent and know their material. So from the perspective of Oliver, a proper process which manages not to be co-opted or misused, will lead also to the good, let's say, social, economic outcomes, right? And of course, a classic example is Porto Alegre, where you had the middle class agreeing to give more of the budget to the poor, right? A kind of through a rational discussion, if you like, this kind of situation arose. On the other hand, for Anna, coming, from a more communist position about things, that's the wrong way to look at things. Porto Alegre could happen because the structural conditions were laid out in advance, right? Fixing the political will not fix the other things necessarily. While, so it was interesting to see, because through their debate there, the discussion and reaction to each other, one could actually, let's say, distill the different positions here, right? The one in which, you first need the structural changes to allow a proper politics to emerge, to the other one that argues that the proper politics will lead to other good outcomes. Now, just to emphasize why this matters, because of course, when you come to a kind of discussion table as unequal communities, individuals, right, with different, one person can use a technical jargon, the other one doesn't, a different status in society. When you come to that political table with lack of equality, it's very difficult to have a fair political discussion to begin with, right? It goes down to the level of language, after all, not just power. So this is a fundamental question, and I don't think there's one answer, because all issues matter.
Yes.
However, I see ourselves more likely to make progress on the political deficit than on the equality one. I see the localism agenda, which is shared by many architects and urbanists, and of course many others, and of course many middle-class people, is strong on the agenda. A government that does austerity and moves away allows localism to flourish in a way, when you have voluntary sector step in, local. But localism will also make bigger gaps between the poor and the rich, right? Localism doesn't redistribute money. No. You can't do that. It will make, and to an extent, look at the United States. Localism has worked there because of the way it's structured. Localism is built into the system. Poorer areas become poorer because they don't have the tax base and there's no redistribution. Wealthier areas become richer. That's the future, and I think that's where things are going, and it has some good sides as well as the bad sides. It's just that this idea of a government which is interventionist and stepping in to fix the ills of society is very difficult to go back to. At least looking at
I think so. Positions. I mean, I was in London a couple of days ago, and I sort of find London a funny place to go. It's a bit like a theme park for people from the regions. It's
I should say it's the first time I've ever heard anybody say that London is a funny place to go.
Well, it's not a serious place.
Okay.
One of the it's increasingly seeming like, so coming back to this point, it's increasingly seeming like a city-state within a country. It spends vastly more on itself than it does on the rest of the country, and you can see as a consequence of that the movements towards regional independence in the UK have a direct relationship to the indifference that is manifest in London. I mean, you come down to where I am in Kent, the roads and pavements don't get fixed, and you go up to London, and they're putting down granite, 4-inch granite slabs in ordinary parts of the city, and it's sort of, it's an absurdity that we've ended up in this situation, and that this is starting to get consolidated into actual urban space. So you can, as you point out, we've got a laissez-faire, what do you call it, a localist kind of agenda, but without the power structures or the checks and balances in place to control that. And so we get radically disempowered poor communities who have to fend for themselves. And I'm doing a little research project on the effects of COVID and lockdown, a British Academy grant that I got, and talking in this very, very, very deprived area of the town I live in, talking to the way that the localism agenda has been used to make up for shortfalls in state processes. The state has stepped back during this period, and localism has been used as a way. So for example, food banks seeing an increase from 100 to 900 daily users, going out of small churches and community centres. I was talking...
Yes, because we should emphasize that when we are talking about localism, we're not talking about the empowerment of local government, which has been disempowered because they've lost so much budget. And I mean, in Edinburgh, in the 2010s, they fired 1,000 employees. Mm-hmm. That's massive. So we are talking actually about the voluntarist local sector, setting up organizations to deal with things like food banks and so on, stepping in because of the absence of government. Yeah,
and it's not even, I mean, when one thinks of these words like localism, it has this kind of a small scale, but institutionalized and regulated political idea built into it. So maybe we need a new word for that. And likewise, maybe we need a new word for voluntary, because most of the people that are now helping voluntarily are doing it because there's an imperative and not because they want to. Like, nobody wants to go around driving around poor parts of East Kent late at night delivering food parcels to starving people. That's not a desire. That's a narrative. So it's very interesting to think about that. But it comes, one of the other things that so then I wanted to think about this idea of agency. So how does architecture potentially, in this post-68 moment, how does it try and affect political agency? How does it, like, what are the strategies that it employs? I mean, obviously they're very diverse, but maybe there's some that could be highlighted.
Okay, I think that is really, again, it's quite useful because it goes to the main argument my book makes. Because, in a way, it's already 4 years old or so. It's one of the solutions, if you like, in the 1970s was this mode of, let's call it aesthetic architecture about architecture. Mm-hmm. I see Eisenman as a big figure because he becomes a kind of spokesperson, a patron of many others, right? But it is a kind of architecture focused on architecture, where quality architecture is about innovation in form, materialization. In Eisenman's studio, you can't bring in anything from the outside, not even context, right? Let alone social issues. It's really pure design and thinking through architectural form. You look, an architect can be responsible only for those specific features which belong to our discipline: typology, form, massing, so on. So that's also something to take into account, that has been dominant for some decades, not necessarily in the industry, because not that much of it has been built, but yet all of our landmark buildings, our key buildings for about 20 years belong to that school of thought, which is totally anti-political, if you like. And again, Eisenman himself argued that architecture, which is about architecture, is an architecture which is critical because it rejects consumer society. Now, fair enough. Let's not go into that, but you can see a kind of positioning here of architecture, about architecture as something which is rebellious, which of course you certainly can't argue anymore when you're getting commissions to build stadiums and big headquarters of office buildings and so on. But anyway, just for kind of historical context, because the current interest was also a reaction after the crisis of 2008 against that kind of architecture. Call for more consciousness, for more social focus and political focus of architecture. So my main argument is that architecture really can make a change which is most significant when it really works with others. The idea that it's not the architect doing solo cutting edge work in his or her studio, but by collaborating with others in other fields, you get that kind of capacity to do other things. That's the reason I also spend more than a chapter early in the book looking into the rise of reformism. It's one example of how a kind of architecture tied itself to a political movement, a nascent, big political movement, which eventually had also its own political parties and so on. But, something which had an ideology, had a target, and could work specifically, as in the case of Ernst May in Frankfurt, on different levels, where you had local politicians who were committed to these forms of reform. You had a planning office, you had architects, and by working across the different scales, you could actually implement difference. You could do something which breaks away and is different. So in a way, architecture that can be oppositional, as long as it is anchored in certain ideologies which cut across different disciplines, different fields of operation. So again, that issue of collaboration, not the architect as a demiurge, the lone artist who can fight against a different society, but as part of a bigger, let's call it movement, though these are not consolidated movements necessarily.
Yeah. So one of the things that reminds me of is that it is so in the late 60s, 70s moment, there's this move away. You call it the post-Fordist society. There's this movement away from this institutional and centralized planning of architecture. And planning is something that we could probably do a whole nother conversation on. But if we stick to architecture, I think that keeps us healthy and keeps it reasonably discreet. But there's this movement away from this control. And there's this rejection by both sides, by both the neoliberal right and by the anarchist left, away from this centralized. And then we get back into, as you say, the Eisenman, the deconstructivists, and all of that formalism. And both of those things to me seem to be about abstraction. So if Peter, and you mentioned Peter Berger, if Peter Berger talks about abstraction as one of the key qualities of modernity, in his book Facing Up to Modernity, he writes a short section in one of his chapter 7, I think, or something like that, on that. This idea of abstraction at the heart of the modern project, the removal, and he cites Arendt and he cites Marx and Weber and Durkheim and people like that. This move away from a kind of terrestrial and embodied engagement with the earth to a kind of cosmic, alienated, to use Arendt, kind of thing. And you get that again with this architecture for architecture's sake, this architecture as art, in the Guggenheim Museum phenomenon kind of thing. And what I wonder about these insurgent practices is are they essentially not postmodernist, but are they anti-modernist? Is what they are essentially trying to do in engaging locally with people and with processes that produce architectural and urban space, are they being anti-modernist? Is this at the heart of their project?
I would say slightly differently. I mean, as somebody who studied architecture in the 1990s, when the word postmodern, the term postmodern was very popular, and it's not used so much anymore, it's been exhausted for various reasons. I think one of the things most would agree on is that the postmodern is not exactly the opposite of the modern.
No.
And if you look at Matai Kalinesco's later editions of his book about the faces of modernity, he added a chapter about postmodernity in which he claims as much. And, I think he's been vindicated, right? The kind of aspect that postmodernity was certain features that existed in modernity and rose to dominance with the kind of switch. So it's not really moving from modernity to not modernity, but it is a different phase of modernity. I think that's where the consensus, I would say, is right now. And that's one of the reasons that postmodernity as a term itself is exhausted, though architecture historians and art historians are very much right now focused on postmodernism and the 1980s. Now, the question of where to place the kind of focus on participation and so on, one of the things that belong to the postmodern is how what used to be the avant-garde becomes a mainstream. Now, I don't mean by that in a simple way that something that was cutting edge becomes common. But if you look at the kind of historic avant-garde of the 1920s, right? And in art, we're talking about Dada, right? About surrealism. We're talking about constructivism. We are not talking about cubism. We are not talking about the mainstream that moved towards abstraction of art, but we're talking about those groups of artists who actually criticized the apartness of art from life. The groups of artists who wanted art to merge with life. And of course, the urinal, right, of Duchamp is a classic, right? You put in a gallery full of abstract art about art. You take an object from everyday life. You force the people looking at it to recognize it as an object which has a function. And of course, that was co-opted, right? You had critics who explained it. This is elevating a work of an everyday object into a work of art, and the threat moves away. But that was really the historic avant-garde. In architecture, the historic avant-garde was an attempt to bring about a collapse of the difference between architecture and urbanism, between the singular building and the city, right? To make a continuum of city and building, just like the artists wanted a continuum of art and society. And of course, with that, when we say continuum of building and city, we're talking about, let's say, the master plans of Le Corbusier, but not his villas, right? We're talking about Ernst May, for example, but not about Hans Scharoun. So that was the historic avant-garde in architecture, very much paralleling the historic avant-garde in art. The thing is that the historic avant-garde in architecture did get built in the post-war years, right? If you look at neighborhoods like the notorious Belmer in southern Amsterdam, Park Hill, these are all structures in which a difference between city and singular building starts vanishing, right? The singular building is the city, right? It's one thing. So fair enough. But one of the things you see when we move into post-68 and today is how some of these tendencies to want a continuum of society and building or city and society is part of what these small young groups of architects are trying to do in their own way, right? It's no longer the singular building which is about its own form and materialization, its shape, its massing, and so on, but it's actually about the connections which are of architecture to what is external to it. So these were, again, the kind of tools of the historic avant-garde, of the avant-garde in general.
Yes.
And therefore, you could say that this fits into the avant-garde's critique of modernity, of mainstream modernity. At the same time, the status of it in architecture is a bit weird because, some of our most celebrated work has been the avant-garde. How much was, Golden Lane of the Smithsons not mainstream despite being avant-garde? You see, so the boundaries are not so clear, but you can see the kind of switch we're talking about, because also in art, from the Duchamp's Ready-Made became one of the most important works of art really after 68, with a kind of shift, and a lot of avant-garde, let's say, instruments became quite mainstream and adopted by many artists once abstraction was exhausted. So you see a kind of switch where these things are normalized, if you like.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but we can't put it also so easily into these different drawers.
No. I mean, one of the things I picked up from reading your work was this idea that these contemporary practices, these contemporary small scale and emergent practices, they sort of, on one level, you could see them as sort of Thatcher's stepchildren, in that they sit within the structures of neoliberalism and they operate through those self-same structures. They rely, in many cases, on these socio-economic and geopolitical logics of those things. But you could also, in a more generous reading, see them as trying to fill in the gaps in that laissez-faire planning. They actually act as a kind of, almost like a filler to the gaps in, and so I had written down an example of this kind of the way that neoliberal capitalism co-opts avant-garde practice in the, I don't know if you know it, the Trinity Buoy Wharf, the container city in London Docklands, where they've built a kind of artist studio right amongst this glistening towers of Canary Wharf, of the Candy Brothers. Or you see it in the Barras Art and Design thing in the Barras Market in East End of Glasgow, where they use containers to gentrify the whole process, to gentrify what was actually quite an authentic space of authentic deprivation and poverty, it has to be said. But so it's a really interesting, and I wondered whether, you know, I suppose to finish, there's lots else I would like to talk about, but you've got other things to do and so on. But I wonder if there's an idea of a planned insurgency. I thought, how do we bring these two things together? Because there's lots of good things about a planned city and a control over capitalist modes of production. But there's also lots of good things about this insurgency, which sits within it. Is there a possibility? Is there anybody talking about how you synthesize these two modes of practice?
Well, I think there are examples. And look, I mean, we are talking from a specific perspective. We and the people around us are mostly, I suppose, creatives, we would call them, if not architects and in similar disciplines. As is often the case, we are dominated by middle class, most of us. And there are certain points of view which plays to our advantage or interest. When you teach young 20-somethings and what inspires them, what do they like? You can see how many times they're designing for themselves or their friends in their mind, even if it's not actually said so explicitly. Partially because that's your life experience, right? So the question of who is it for is a big one. Who are you working with? And then how do you get to know who it is, right? How do you imagine who it is? You have to come to know these communities, to know other people, to be able to design for other people. Otherwise, it's just a kind of abstract thing. You're left for designing, left to design for yourself. But what I wanted to say is the case of, let's say, Northern Europe again, not Britain. With, I think outside London, we could generally say urban development is atrocious. And actually in London, socially even worse, of course, right? Even if architecturally it's sometimes now okay. You go to other cities. You go to Amsterdam, you go to Copenhagen, you go to Malmo. And, architects go there, architecture students go there. City council planners also go there. And they say, wow, we want to do this when we go back. We want to do this in Newcastle. We want to do this in Bristol. We want to do this in Cardiff. But they can't actually, right? They think they can because they think it's only about their, imagination and willpower. But there are structural, again, reasons that prevent that from happening. So what is it that one actually appreciates it when one comes from UK and visits those other cities? And, there is a kind of quality, the quality of urban development. Which seems to satisfy a lot of the demands. That's what one would like. I would point out that in countries like Sweden and Denmark, the profession of the architect is not even protected. Anyone can call themselves an architect. One of the biggest differences is that in all of these countries, planning is still much stronger than in Britain. For example, when I worked in an office in the Netherlands, we could call the planning office and rat about our developer, that the developer wants one single window repeating on a 250-meter long facade. And then the planner would call the developer and threaten them. Don't do that, or your whole project's not getting the green light. Yeah. Right? I could not imagine that really happening in the UK. The power of planning is much stronger. And there's a selection of architects in which not just the developer has the say, and sometimes the developer is not even allowed on that committee. And a selection of architects, and there's a lot of things which are wrong about what goes on in these countries. But just to say, there's a reason why you get these different products, which is structural. It's not that they have better architects, though maybe they do select the better architects because they have a different process of selection. So, there are structural issues which matter here. And when you go to these cities, you also see how the planning departments are savvy and how they work with these small other groups to plug gaps, right? This idea that when you're doing planning from above to a degree, you can't deal with the detail. Then you bring on board art groups, architecture, small groups to deal with things that fall in between. The kind of enrichment, right? The everyday life enrichment that actual planning doesn't do. At the same time, while we coming from UK might look at this and say, wow, isn't that amazing? Wouldn't we like to do it? The journey taken is the same direction. It's increasing, it's not as if these developments are more or much more, they're a bit more equal. But, the direction is also from a society which was more equal to society that is less equal. The direction is also neoliberal. It's just a different face of neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. It's a softer face, so we can envy it. I think it's right to envy it, but it's not really optimal. It is a direction in which cities like Malmö and Amsterdam and Copenhagen are becoming more and more the cities of the rich. Less quickly than it happened to London, more slowly because there is still more control, more planning, and more government presence. And again, as creatives, we look at what they do and we can say, wow, and we can understand and see why, but also be a little bit careful with what it is we are looking at and appreciating.
I remember speaking to a lass from the Netherlands, an architect who said, well, part of the secret of their success was a class cleansing that went on when they did their urban renewal projects, Borneo, Sporenburg and things like that. There was a strategy in place, and you can see this in Glasgow very strongly. A lot of academic writing has noticed that the urban renewal, and you talk about this as well, that you return to the city of the middle classes, the creative classes, Richard Florida's creative urbanism and so on and so forth. And that was actually employed, but it's employed in a more, as you say, with a softer face, perhaps with a smile, whereas in Britain it comes across as very stark.
I think one of the differences is that government is stronger in these countries. Mm. In Britain, the developer makes so many decisions. The fact that the developer looks through the local plan, this one document produced every 4 years, and if the developer ticks the boxes, right, usually it's very difficult to stop the project. Mm-hmm. While when government has more power, they can just vote down in the city council the project, right? They can block it just like that. So the weakness of government, which is the weakness of planning, the power of developers, which one of the things which makes that difference. When you speak to planners in these other countries, they do have a clear idea that they are interested in public good, but they haven't really, and they are much more sophisticated in the ways that, they can say, it's like I spoke some years ago to a developer who worked for Schiphol Real Estate, right? A company that has holding around the airports where they develop kind of office estates and stuff like that. They were trying to acquire an area between Amsterdam and the airport, right? So I asked him, what do you do if you manage to get that? And he looked at the map and he pointed out a McDonald's that existed there. He said, that has to go. And then he pointed at the squat and said, that can stay. Mm-hmm. Now, that might sound to us enlightened, but rather than enlightened, it's simply a step smarter and more sophisticated. This squat wasn't a drug den. It was a place which had a lot of cultural activities. Mm-hmm. So it's great to have, while the area you are developing is actually pretty barren. There's nothing there. It's dead. And then you have this squat that does these kind of Christmas parties or kind of happenings. So, you can see how that's a kind of smartness, but also very neoliberal. Yeah. Very much co-opting. Mm-hmm. And of course, the squat would also go, right? It would also vanish when it's no longer useful. Mm. Yes. So, this is not a direction to emulate in many senses, or at least not in complete sense. The direction of travel is similar. It's just a nicer travel.
Yes. A nicer ride. And
it is a nicer ride, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I don't want to go on for much longer, but I did want to touch on this last thing, because I like to finish on a hopeful note, this idea of praxis.
Yes.
This idea of these praxis is a complicated word, and it's one of these academic, politically enlightened kind of words. And would you be able to kind of, I suppose, open that word out and talk about perhaps how it funnily enough, in your book, you talk about, for example, in your chapter on praxis, you start off by talking about the Atelier d'Architecture Autogérée. I spent a fortnight in there and worked on a couple of their projects because I was a student under Doina Petrescu. So I kind of understand it, but perhaps you could open out a little bit about this idea of praxis and its possibilities, I suppose.
Okay, just a bit concisely, just a few things about that. First of all, the term itself, praxis. One of the things that praxis entails is a kind of activity in which its goals or aims are within the activity itself. They're not external to the activity, right? Yeah. So if I go and do a job so I can earn a living and pay my rent, that's practice maybe, but it's not praxis. The goal is external. I don't enjoy my job. I just do it for the money. However, if I'm, let's say, a craftsperson and I'm carving away something, maybe that's a goal. I enjoy the making, actually, right? So that's praxis. For many of us, actually, praxis is the ideal. I would actually also put a question mark above that and point out that, if we really want agency and effect beyond, practice is not such a bad thing. We sometimes have to do things we don't really enjoy for a goal which is external to the job itself, right? So it's not that one is good, one is bad. It's just different things. Okay, the question of praxis and hope. First of all, hope, I think, is very important. I think that's one of the reasons a lot of us like reading the work of Henri Lefebvre. Unlike his student, Jean Baudrillard, there's always hope in Lefebvre. He's always looking for an opportunity, for something which is not co-opted, something which is different, something you can learn from. So the idea of hope is a very important one. I think we can be skeptical and doubtful and even a little bit cynical as long as we still have hope, right? A kind of balance between these things, about a kind of not a blind belief in something, but in fact a kind of weary kind of hope is important. And again, praxis, interesting. If you look up, there's a couple of articles that someone called Card, while doing his MSc, traveled to the United States. He had interviews with a lot of these practices, interested in doing good, and it's quite a good, let's say, overview of young people involved in these kind of practices and the problem of the economy, how to actually make a living, right? And one of the issues is we are all within a certain system that, if we don't play the game to some degree, it will just spit us out, right? And that's it, So it touches upon issues of how do we make a living? How do we pay our own rent if we want to do good? How do we manage to make that happen? So how does it manage to take that kind of condition, create that condition, is an important one and a difficult one. There are questions to the discipline as a whole. So, if you can be a different kind of office, is it something that all architecture can learn from it? Or is it just left to a few cutting edge offices? Is it something, take someone like Eyal Weizmann, right? Working through forensic architecture. This is great, but this is not a model that all architecture offices can deploy. It's a consultancy model. So, is there anything that others can also do? Is it just your specific niche that you managed to develop? And well done if you've done that too, right? So there's a question again of how do you operate within existing conditions? How can you have impact? And how much do you enter into negotiating, and what do you accept or not accept of current conditions? That's always, these decisions are difficult, and we are dependent on the circumstances to some degree.
I think that's a good point to finish on. And it comes back to this point about localism, the unleashed localism, which is unstoppable now because of the social inequality, economic inequality that emerged after 2008. And I think that when you look at practices like WikiHouse and Assembled, Architecture 00, you are seeing people who are attempting in a way to manufacture a new reality, a new possible reality, which is based around, as you say, a very situated kind of practice. And it's not going to make them staggeringly rich. But that's another reality, I think, that they're happy to live amongst, that the kind of starchitecture moment of millionaire architects maybe has gone.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't call them millionaire architects, but architects for millionaires, because a lot of them have gone bust over the years. But I mean, you can see for some years that Pritzker Prize is struggling to find star architects, right? It was born for star architects, right, as a prize, and it's giving others, not just Aravena, but generally ones who don't have that kind of standing as the Zaha Hadids, the Rem Koolhaases, all of those big figures. Obviously, we've run out of star architects, and for good reasons, I think, right? That makes sense. Look, I mean, there are different degrees of helping society, right? And overambition is great, but not the most helpful. I know a lot of architects who can be very satisfied from designing just a very good, staircase the way they wanted it and managing to realize it properly. And we all know that's a struggle. I mean, that's one of the reasons I am not practicing as an architect. I didn't find that rewarding. But some people do. Come on. I mean, some people do, and I do understand it. I do understand it because I did manage to actually pull off a good list staircase once or twice, and there was satisfaction. Simply not enough for me. But I mean, so it is the place where what you do contributes something, right? We all want to contribute in whatever profession to society. We want to do something which contributes. So it might be contributing through providing somebody good living conditions. It might be more around issues of equality and working on affordable housing and how to produce affordable housing which is of quality, right? And of course also sustainable. Nowadays everything has to be. So there are different fields in which we operate. Some will have more impact, some less. At the end of the day, I think the important thing is that we all want to feel we're contributing, and when we are in a place where we're not, I think we have to move to another place. And that is possible. That's what people do. People do that. They move from one office, which is doing work they cannot identify with, to another. I know a Mexican architect who left Mexico because he found himself working on corrupt projects, housing projects built over what were previously mines. So, so he didn't want to be involved. He left one office and another just because of this reason. Good reasons. So there are some opportunities.
But I do like this. I do like this idea that comes back to this idea that architecture is efficacious, that it does a thing, it can do a thing, and I think that these autonomous practices are perhaps the latest phase in that perhaps perpetual story in architecture of looking to be effective and looking to improve the lot of, as you say, for justice or goodness, maybe for goodness.
So right now our hopes rest on them, I suppose. Let's hope they do a good job.
Let's hope they do a good job. Okay, thank you very much, Tahl. It's been really wonderful to hear you.
Good to speak to you again after a long time.
Yeah, indeed. And so it goes. Thanks again to Tahl. Please follow the links in the description to his recent books and his papers. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, like and share Airs for Architecture, as behooves socially connected folk like you. Until next Monday, cheers.